My best friend recorded my panic attacks without telling me and said, "Even if I'm using your story, it'll help people like you." When I begged her to stop, she smiled and said, "I've done it before." I didn't say a word. That was 19 months ago. Yesterday, she lost her academic career forever. 2 years ago, I lost the use of my legs in a car accident. That's when campus became this nightmare maze of broken elevators and locked accessible entrances. I ate lunch alone every day because my old friends treated me like I might break if they said the wrong thing. Then Rachel appeared. She watched me struggle with a heavy library door and didn't just help, she got angry on my behalf. She knew every accessibility law and made the administration actually listen. Within weeks, she introduced me to the campus disability advocacy group. For the first time since my accident, I felt normal again. Rachel became my closest friend. She stayed up until 3 a.m., helping me write complaints about inaccessible bathrooms. She drove me to medical appointments when I was too anxious to go alone. When I had panic attacks about my future, she talked me through them with this calm confidence that made everything seem manageable. But Rachel asked a lot of questions, specific ones about my darkest moments after the accident. She wanted details about my adjustment process and coping mechanisms. I thought she was just trying to understand my experience better. She took notes during our conversations, which seemed weird, but she said it was for advocacy planning. One night, I found a small voice recorder in her bag during a group meeting. She laughed it off, saying she used it for taking notes since her handwriting was terrible. Something felt off, but Rachel had done so much for me that questioning her felt ungrateful. Last Tuesday, I was studying with Rachel in the library when she stepped away to take a call. Her laptop was open, and I saw a document titled Disability Trauma Narratives, a Qualitative Analysis. I clicked on it, and my stomach dropped as I recognized my own words quoted verbatim from conversations I thought were private. There was a folder labeled Audio Files TM My Initials. I clicked it and found dozens of recordings of our most intimate conversations. My voice describing the night I tried to hurt myself 6 months after my accident. The breakdown I had in her car when I realized I'd never walk again. Every vulnerable moment I'd shared was cataloged like research data. When Rachel came back, I confronted her directly. She got defensive immediately, claiming I was being paranoid and that it was just general research. I pressed harder, asking about the audio files with my initials. Her face changed completely. The warm, supportive expression I knew so well disappeared, and something cold took its place. She told me that even if she was using my story, which she wasn't saying she was, it would be helping people like me. I demanded to see everything she had on me. Rachel refused and got angry, telling me she couldn't believe I didn't trust her after everything she'd done for me. I told her those were my stories to tell, not hers. She told me that it didn't matter and that she had done it before. I asked her to explain, and Rachel admitted she made it a habit to befriend any student on campus with obvious disabilities so she could study them. It wasn't personal, it was methodology. The entire disability advocacy group was essentially her research lab filled with students she'd cultivated as unwitting subjects. She defended her methods, asking how else she was supposed to get authentic data since people don't open up in formal interviews. I tried telling other group members, but Rachel had convinced each of us we were her special friend, while systematically studying us all. Some members defended her, saying at least someone cared about our experiences. I filed a formal complaint with the University Ethics Board. The complaint revealed how Rachel had used the advocacy group as an unethical research laboratory targeting disabled students under the guise of friendship. Yesterday, I got an email from Rachel that made my blood run cold. She said she'd already submitted her thesis with all the recordings from multiple subjects, and these stories would be published whether we liked it or not. I clicked the link with trembling fingers. The page loaded slowly, revealing a professional conference website. My heart stopped. There it was, a research submission portal for the International Disability Studies Conference. The preview window auto-played audio that I recognized immediately. My own voice, broken and raw, describing my sewer slide attempt from 6 months after the accident. The view counter showed 847. My phone rang. Mom's name flashed on the screen. I answered with a shaky hand. Her voice came through panicked and confused. She asked if I was safe, if I was okay. She kept repeating that Rachel had sent her something disturbing. Mom explained that Rachel had emailed her the conference link with a note saying she thought Mom should know how much pain I was still in. My mother's voice shook as she begged me to come home immediately. I grabbed my keys and drove to my parents' house, my mind racing. The 20-minute drive felt like hours. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Rachel's car already there. My stomach churned. Inside, I found Rachel sitting on our living room couch, holding my sobbing mother's hand. She looked up at me with that same caring expression she'd perfected over months of pretending to be my friend. Mom rushed to hug me, asking why I hadn't told her I was still struggling so much. Rachel stood slowly, explaining how she'd discovered these concerning signs about my mental state. She positioned herself as the worried friend who just wanted to help. My father emerged from the kitchen, insisting Rachel stay for dinner. He thanked her repeatedly for alerting them to my situation. I sat at the dinner table, watching Rachel serve my favorite meal, chicken parmesan with extra mozzarella. She knew exactly how I liked it. Later, I realized she must have extracted that information from recorded conversations with my mother during what she called support check-ins. Throughout dinner, Rachel shared intimate details about our friendship. She told stories that sounded caring to my parents, but felt like violations to me. She mentioned private conversations, framing them as examples of how she'd been supporting me. My parents hung on every word, grateful someone was looking out for their child. After dinner, I overheard Rachel speaking privately with my father in his study. She expressed worry about my isolation and what she called obsessive behavior. She used clinical terms, making my anger about her research sound like paranoia. I stood in the hallway, listening to my father promise to monitor me more closely. The next morning, my phone rang early. My disability benefits caseworker explained that someone had filed a concerned citizen report about my deteriorating mental health. The report claimed my condition was affecting my ability to perform daily living skills. They needed me to come in for an immediate assessment. During the benefits interview that afternoon, the caseworker asked specific questions about my daily routines. She knew about my bathroom schedule, when I took my medications, even details about my therapy appointments. The information could only have come from Rachel's recordings. The caseworker mentioned that the concerned citizen had provided extensive documentation about about my recent behavior changes. Rachel arrived at the benefits office while I was still being interviewed. She introduced herself as my support person, claiming she'd been helping me manage my disability. She described what she called concerning behavioral changes with clinical precision. I recognized my own words from private conversations, twisted into evidence of deterioration. The benefits investigator took notes as Rachel spoke. She recommended an immediate psychiatric evaluation based on Rachel's detailed report. Rachel had painted me as someone experiencing paranoid delusions, specifically about being researched and recorded without consent. That evening, I discovered something even worse. My therapist called to discuss some concerning information she'd received. Rachel had been sending her audio clips, claiming to be my designated support person authorized to share progress updates. My therapist's notes from recent sessions contained my exact words from conversations I'd had with Rachel in her car. My therapist admitted she'd been adjusting my treatment based on Rachel's observations. She thought Rachel was helping by providing additional context about my daily life. She had no idea these were research recordings made without my knowledge. Rachel called the next day, offering to drive me to the psychiatric evaluation. She acted like nothing had happened, maintaining her supportive friend persona. During the car ride, I noticed her phone propped up on the dashboard, recording my anxiety responses as we drove. My younger sibling called me that night, confessing something that made me sick. They'd been giving Rachel updates about our family's concerns because she'd convinced them she was monitoring my suicidal thoughts. Rachel knew exactly what questions to ask, my sibling said. She seemed so knowledgeable about mental health warning signs. I started paying attention to the timing of Rachel's supportive phone calls. They always came right after my therapy appointments, when I was most vulnerable. She was creating artificial crisis cycles, calling when she knew I'd be emotional, then recording my responses for her research. Everything became clear when I met Rachel's boyfriend at a coffee shop. He recognized me immediately. He'd been my physical therapist after the accident. He casually mentioned sharing observations about regression patterns he'd noticed during our sessions. He thought Rachel was a family member helping with my care. The intimate medical details he'd shared were things only my treatment team should have known. I found a way into Rachel's apartment when she was at class. In her desk, I discovered my medical records with sections highlighted in yellow. Notes in the margins analyzed my emotional volatility and what she called dependency behaviors. Everything was categorized and cross-referenced with her recordings. Rachel had been coordinating with my academic advisor too. Emails between them discussed documenting my declining performance as part of her longitudinal trauma study. My advisor thought he was contributing to research that would help disabled students. My best friend finally admitted why they'd been distant lately. Rachel had convinced them I needed to develop independence. She said staying away would help me heal. Then she recorded my isolation responses, documenting how I reacted to losing my support system. I discovered Rachel had been living in my apartment complex for 3 months. The random encounters in the laundry room, the coincidental meetings in the parking lot, all carefully timed to study my natural behavior patterns. She'd been watching me long before we officially met. Her research notes revealed something horrifying. During her helpful apartment visits, she'd been hiding my pain medication to study withdrawal effects. The days I thought I'd miscounted my pills, the times I felt worse than usual, all manufactured for her research. Even my service dog had been affected. He showed confusion around Rachel's commands after weeks of her offering treats during visits. She'd disrupted his training, documenting his altered responses as part of her study on disability support systems. Rachel admitted she'd received a research grant specifically for studying my case. For 2 years, my trauma had been funding her education. The grant application described me as an ideal subject with clearly documented trauma markers. I realized our friendship began exactly when my initial trauma therapy ended. She'd timed her approach to study what she called post-treatment adjustment patterns. Every moment of our friendship had been calculated for maximum research value. Rachel revealed she had enough recorded material to publish multiple papers about my adaptation mechanisms. She didn't need my consent anymore. The data was collected, transcribed, and analyzed. My most private moments had become academic property. I watched Rachel's brother arrive at my parents' house the following week. My older brother Nathan had always been protective of me since the accident, but Rachel had been texting him for days. She'd shared carefully edited recordings of me expressing frustration about his overprotectiveness. By the time he walked through our parents' door, he viewed me differently. Rachel greeted him with a warm hug, mentioning his childhood nickname, Nate the Great, that I'd shared during one of our recorded conversations about family dynamics. Nathan sat across from me at the kitchen table while Rachel prepared coffee. She knew exactly how he liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream, information she'd extracted from my descriptions of family breakfast routines. I watched her work, noting how she touched his shoulder when placing the mug in front of him, how she laughed at his jokes with practiced warmth. The transformation happened quickly. Within 2 weeks, they were dating. Rachel attended our family dinners, sitting in my usual spot next to Nathan. She'd reference inside jokes from stories I'd told her, creating false intimacy through stolen memories. My attempts to warn Nathan failed. Rachel had already played him recordings where I complained about feeling suffocated by family concern. He interpreted my warnings as jealousy over losing my best friend to him. I confronted Nathan in his apartment one evening. He showed me his phone, revealing voice messages Rachel had sent him. My own voice filled the room, describing what Rachel called my obsessive behavior patterns regarding her research. The recordings were real but stripped of context. Me processing the betrayal became evidence of instability. Nathan asked me to get help, suggesting I was having paranoid episodes. Rachel had given him articles about trauma-induced psychosis. My therapy journals disappeared from my apartment during Rachel's next supportive visit. I'd hidden them in my closet, but she'd photographed every page while pretending to help me organize. Those pages appeared in her research proposal, submitted to the university's psychology department. My most private thoughts about suicide, my struggles with identity after becoming disabled, my fears about the future, all transformed into academic data points. Rachel's research assistant approached me outside the library. She introduced herself as Catherine, explaining she'd been hired to implement something called the TM method with other disabled students. Rachel had created a training manual based on my exploitation. Catherine showed me the document on her laptop, a step-by-step guide for gaining vulnerable students' trust, identifying identifying their emotional triggers, and maintaining access to their private lives. I found video files on a shared drive Catherine gave me access to. Hours of footage from Rachel's apartment visits, me struggling with transfers, crying during panic attacks, dealing with bathroom difficulties. Each video had clinical labels. Subject TM, Authentic Disability Experience Documentation, Day 127. The camera angles revealed she'd hidden recording devices throughout my living space during her helpful visits. The Academic Ethics Board scheduled a preliminary review of my complaint. Rachel's advisor, Dr. Jonathan Chen, argued her methods represented groundbreaking immersive research. He presented her work as the future of disability studies, dismissing my consent concerns as retroactive regret. The board seemed more interested in protecting the university's research reputation than addressing the exploitation. I discovered Rachel had been accessing my student email for months. She'd watched me log into library computers during our study sessions, memorizing my password. Through my email, she'd tracked my class schedules, therapy appointments, and communications with disability services. She knew exactly when I'd be vulnerable, when I'd be alone, when I'd need support. Rachel's social media transformed my image into academic currency. Photos from our friendship, me in my wheelchair at campus events, struggling with accessibility barriers, celebrating small victories, appeared in her conference presentation materials. She'd built her academic reputation on my stolen moments, gaining recognition as an innovative researcher, while I remained an anonymous case study. My campus therapist revealed Rachel had been attending our disability support group meetings for months. She'd presented herself as my advocate and emotional support person, taking notes during our most vulnerable group discussions. Other members' stories appeared in her research too, their private struggles transformed into datasets. The therapist had welcomed her presence, believing she was helping me cope. Rachel presented at the Regional Disability Studies Conference. I watched the live stream from my laptop, feeling sick as she played audio recordings of my private conversations. Academic audiences took notes while my voice described the night I'd wanted to die. She discussed my fascinating adaptation mechanisms with clinical detachment. The presentation ended with applause. My trauma had become entertainment. The financial aid office contacted me about concerns regarding my psychological fitness for continued enrollment. Rachel's documented worries about my mental state had triggered a review. My funding hung in the balance while I struggled to prove my stability. The stress worsened my physical symptoms. Spasticity increased. Transfers became harder. My carefully maintained routine crumbled. Rachel's research partner revealed the full scope of their project. They'd been conducting family support surveys with my relatives, introduced through Rachel's established relationship as my trusted friend. My aunts, uncles, and cousins had shared their observations about my recovery, believing they were helping Rachel help me. Their private concerns became research data about family systems and disability. I realized Rachel had been wearing my clothes during her research presentations. Items that disappeared during her laundry assistance visits reappeared in conference photos. She wore my favorite sweater while discussing my case, my adaptive clothing while analyzing my subject behaviors. The violation felt visceral. She'd literally wrapped herself in my identity while reducing me to data. Rachel offered a deal through her lawyer. She would destroy all recordings if I signed retroactive consent forms legitimizing her research. The forms included clauses preventing me from discussing her methods publicly. Refusing meant she'd release concerning recordings to disability services, my family, and academic departments. My choice was silence or destruction. I refused her offer. Rachel's response was swift. Recordings appeared in my department chair's inbox. My professors received files documenting my deteriorating mental state. My academic standing crumbled as faculty questioned my ability to complete coursework. Rachel framed her concerns as those of a worried friend trying to prevent tragedy. The previous advocacy group leader contacted me through social media. They'd left campus abruptly the previous year, and now I understood why. They shared recordings they'd made of Rachel discussing her plans for studying me. In the audio, Rachel described me as the perfect subject with clearly documented trauma markers and minimal support system interference. I'd been targeted from the beginning. I learned Rachel had overcome my initial resistance using techniques from my own therapy recordings. She'd studied my trust patterns, identifying exactly how to approach me when my defenses were lowest. My therapist's notes about building healthy relationships became Rachel's blueprint for manipulation. She'd weaponized my healing against me. My parents chose to maintain their relationship with Rachel despite my evidence. She'd convinced them she was monitoring my mental health, providing updates they desperately wanted. They believed she understood my condition better than I did. Family dinners continued with Rachel at the table while I ate alone in my apartment. She sent them regular reports about my concerning isolation. The loss of family support felt like drowning. Rachel had inserted herself so completely into my life that extracting her meant losing everyone I loved. My brother brought her to family gatherings. My parents consulted her about my care. My siblings shared their concerns with her. I became the unstable one, the paranoid one, the one who needed help. I started recording our interactions using the methods Rachel had taught me through example. My phone captured her admission that she'd been studying me for months before our first meeting. I documented her discussions with other researchers about subject cultivation techniques. The evidence grew, but gathering it required becoming like her, manipulative, calculating, always recording. Catherine agreed to help me expose the full scope of Rachel's research. I manipulated her by pretending to be Sewers Lytle, knowing she'd been trained to respond to crisis. She revealed databases full of disabled students' private information, recordings cataloged by trauma type, analysis frameworks for vulnerability patterns. My performance of desperation got results, but I hated who I was becoming. Evidence emerged showing Rachel had been analyzing my entire family's dynamics through our recorded conversations. She'd treated my descriptions of family interactions as data about collective trauma responses. My stories about Nathan's protectiveness, my mother's anxiety, my father's distance, all became research material about how families adapt to acquired disabilities. My ex-boyfriend contacted me with disturbing news. Rachel had approached him seeking interviews about my pre-disability personality. She wanted to create longitudinal analyses comparing who I was before to who I'd become. He'd refused confused, but others hadn't. High school friends, former teammates, old teachers, she'd contacted them all, building a complete picture of my transformation. The stress of fighting Rachel while maintaining my academic performance triggered severe health complications. Spasticity worsened until transfers became dangerous. Chronic pain increased until medication barely helped. My carefully maintained independence crumbled as my body responded to psychological trauma with physical deterioration. Rachel documented these changes too, adding them to her study on stress responses in disabled populations. My part-time campus job ended when Rachel shared concerns with my supervisor. She'd presented recordings of me expressing frustration about work tasks, framing normal venting as evidence of instability. The lost income meant choosing between rent and medical supplies. I started skipping physical therapy to save money, knowing Rachel would document the decline in my physical function. A public confrontation at the Disability Resource Center exposed Rachel's influence. Staff revealed she'd been consulting with them as an expert on my case. While I sought accommodations, she provided context about my mental state. Her academic credentials gave her authority to shape how support services viewed me. The people meant to help me had been turned into additional data sources. My housing application for the next semester was denied. Rachel's documented concerns about my behavioral instability had been included in my residential life file. The accessible dorm room I needed went to another student while I searched for off-campus alternatives. Every apartment viewing became a reminder of how thoroughly she'd dismantled my life. I moved into an accessible motel room, paying week by week with dwindling savings. The cramped space barely accommodated my wheelchair. I watched through social media as Rachel presented my research at prestigious conferences. She won awards for innovation while I struggled to afford groceries. My story funded her rising career while I faced homelessness. My younger sibling begged me to stop fighting Rachel. The family couldn't handle the constant conflict. They saw Rachel as helpful and me as destructive. My siblings' tears gutted me. I was tearing our family apart by refusing to accept Rachel's help. The isolation felt complete. Even my own family saw me as the problem. My investigation revealed another victim, a student with cerebral palsy whom Rachel had studied the previous year. When I contacted them with evidence, they blamed me for ruining the only person who'd understood them. Their family threatened legal action if I continued harassing Rachel. She'd helped their child access mental health resources, they said. The fact that she'd also stolen their private moments didn't matter. More victims emerged as I dug deeper. Each one Rachel had convinced they were special. Each one she'd systematically documented. Some still defended her, unable to accept that their friendship had been fabricated. Others were too afraid to speak up, worried about losing support systems. I had to continue exposing her despite knowing each revelation destroyed another vulnerable person's world. My last remaining friend asked difficult questions. What if Rachel's research actually helped disabled people? What if her methods, though unethical, produced valuable insights? Was I destroying important research out of personal anger? I couldn't answer without sounding selfish. The greater good argument haunted me. Was my privacy worth more than potential breakthroughs in trauma treatment? I made the hardest decision of my life. To prove Rachel's exploitation, I publicly revealed the extent of my suicidal ideation after the accident. I shared details I'd never told anyone except Rachel, re-traumatizing my family and friends. Watching my mother cry as she learned how close she'd come to losing me felt like betrayal, but I needed people to understand what Rachel had stolen. The evidence revealed my own complicity. I'd missed multiple opportunities to seek proper help because I'd become emotionally dependent on Rachel's support. Professional therapists, legitimate support groups, actual friends, I'd chosen Rachel instead. My desperation for understanding had made me vulnerable to exploitation. The realization that I'd participated in my own manipulation was crushing. Rachel's research advisor expedited the ethics review to protect the department's reputation. The hearing was scheduled during my regular medical appointment day, with limited committee availability cited as the reason. My health had deteriorated so much under the stress that missing treatment wasn't an option. I faced choosing between my physical health and my fight for justice. Understanding Rachel's motivation made everything worse. She genuinely believed her research would revolutionize trauma therapy. In her mind, capturing authentic disabled experiences without clinical filters would transform treatment approaches. Her methods were wrong, but her intentions weren't entirely evil. She'd become addicted to the intimacy of others' pain while convincing herself she was helping. The most disturbing revelation was that Rachel loved me, not as a friend, but as a fascinating subject whose adaptation patterns captivated her. Her affection was real, but filtered through academic fascination. She cared about my well-being because my continued survival meant more data. The mix of genuine emotion and clinical interest made her betrayal more complex than simple exploitation. Fighting Rachel required violating my own ethics. To prove patterns of exploitation, I had to share other victims' private information. Their stories weren't mine to tell, but telling them was the only way to establish systematic abuse. I became complicit in the same privacy violations I was fighting against. Each revelation felt like betrayal of vulnerable people who'd already been betrayed. My principles about protecting vulnerable people crumbled as desperation grew. I manipulated Catherine into revealing more evidence by threatening sewerslide. I recorded other victims without their knowledge, gathering proof of Rachel's methods. I used the very techniques Rachel had taught me, becoming a mirror of my exploiter. Victory would require becoming what I hated. The final evidence came from Rachel's research assistant. I convinced Catherine I was contemplating sewerslide again, knowing her training would compel her to act. She revealed archived recordings of Rachel instructing other researchers in manipulation techniques. The systematic nature of the exploitation became undeniable. Rachel hadn't just studied me. She'd created a template for exploiting vulnerable populations. Exposing Rachel's methods felt hollow when I realized what I'd become. The fight for justice had transformed me into someone equally manipulative. I'd learned to weaponize vulnerability, to perform trauma for results, to violate others' privacy for evidence. Rachel had taught me well. The student had become the teacher, and I hated myself for it. Rachel's appeal to the ethics board focused on her groundbreaking research contributions. She presented testimonials from academics who'd used her data to develop new therapeutic approaches. The board faced a choice between protecting vulnerable vulnerable subjects, and advancing disability research. Innovation versus ethics. Progress versus consent. My trauma versus potential breakthroughs. Everything depended on whether the board valued research innovation over subject protection. Rachel's methods were spreading through academic departments nationwide. Young researchers saw her as a pioneer who'd found ways to capture authentic disabled experiences. If the board ruled in her favor, exploitation would become standard practice. If they ruled against her, important research might be stifled. The ethics hearing approached with both of us damaged by our conflict. My health had visibly deteriorated. Weight loss, increased spasticity, chronic exhaustion from fighting. Rachel's academic identity was crumbling as whispers about her methods spread through conferences. We'd destroyed each other in pursuit of our truths. Neither of us would emerge unchanged. My relationship with Nathan reached a breaking point. He brought Rachel to meet our extended family at our cousin's wedding. She charmed everyone with stories about helping me, using intimate knowledge of family dynamics to seem like she belonged. Watching her integrate into my family while I sat isolated felt like losing everything. She wore my grandmother's bracelet that Nathan had given her, a family heirloom I'd described in recordings. Academic colleagues began choosing sides. Some supported Rachel's innovative research methods, arguing that traditional approaches failed to capture authentic disabled experiences. Others recognized the exploitation, understanding that consent couldn't be retroactive. The disability studies field split between those prioritizing research advancement and those protecting vulnerable subjects. My case became a battleground for competing ethical philosophies. I discovered the ethics review process protected researchers more than subjects. University liability depended on defending approved research methods. If Rachel's approach was deemed unethical, every study using similar methods would face scrutiny. The institution had financial incentives to legitimize her work. My individual exploitation mattered less than protecting the university's research funding and reputation. A disability rights attorney revealed the scope of Rachel's influence. Psychology departments nationwide were adopting her methods as standard practice. Young researchers attended her workshops on subject cultivation. Universities praised her innovative approaches to accessing vulnerable populations. My exploitation had become a teaching tool, spreading through academia like an infection. Future disabled students would face similar violations. The attorney would only pursue my case if I accepted media attention. Taking Rachel down meant going public with my most private moments. My sewer slide attempt, my bathroom struggles, my identity crisis, everything would become news. The attorney explained that public pressure was the only way to force institutional change. My trauma would need to become a spectacle to prevent others' exploitation. Media coverage revealed how far my story had spread without my knowledge. Rachel had been presenting my case study at conferences for 2 years. Disability researchers recognized details from her presentations. I'd been unknowingly famous in academic circles. My trauma discussed in lecture halls and symposiums. Strangers knew intimate details about my life while I remained anonymous. Subject TM conference recordings emerged, showing Rachel teaching subject management techniques. She instructed researchers on building trust with vulnerable populations, maintaining access through emotional manipulation, and documenting authentic responses. My exploitation had become pedagogy. She'd systematized the violation of disabled people's privacy, creating academic frameworks for abuse. The evidence proved Rachel coached others in emotional manipulation strategies. Young researchers learned to identify vulnerability markers, exploit support needs, and maintain subject compliance through calculated friendship. She'd professionalized predation, giving it academic legitimacy. The scope extended far beyond my individual case. She'd created an entire methodology of exploitation. I realized justice meant preventing Rachel's methods from becoming standard practice. This wasn't just about my stolen privacy or violated trust. Future disabled students would suffer if her approach gained legitimacy. My fight became larger than personal vindication. I had to endure public exposure to protect others from similar exploitation. The choice felt impossible: my privacy or their protection. The local news reporter contacted me after finding conference footage online. Rachel had presented my case at 12 academic conferences over 2 years, each time playing more intimate recordings. Disability studies researchers across 3 states recognized details from her presentations. Graduate students told me they'd analyzed my adaptation patterns in their coursework. I'd become a teaching example without ever knowing it. I discovered my case study details circulating in research forums. Anonymous posts discussed subject TM's fascinating trauma responses and debated Rachel's methodology. Researchers shared timestamps of particularly compelling audio clips. Someone had created a timeline of my mental health deterioration based on Rachel's presentations. My most vulnerable moments had become academic entertainment. Conference recordings arrived from a sympathetic attendee. The footage showed Rachel demonstrating what she called organic trust-building techniques. She played audio of our early conversations, pausing to highlight manipulation opportunities. The audience took notes as she explained how to identify optimal vulnerability windows in disabled subjects. My exploitation had become a masterclass. The evidence revealed Rachel's systematic approach to emotional manipulation. She'd created flowcharts showing how to respond to different trauma responses. Decision trees mapped pathways from initial contact to sustained access. She taught researchers to recognize resistance patterns and overcome them using subjects' own therapeutic goals. Every aspect of our friendship had been choreographed. I understood that stopping Rachel meant preventing an entire methodology from spreading. Psychology departments had already integrated her techniques into graduate training. Young researchers viewed her as innovative rather than exploitative. If her methods gained institutional approval, thousands of vulnerable people would face similar violations. My personal fight had become a systemic battle. The decision to testify publicly meant accepting permanent exposure. Court documents would preserve my trauma in legal records. Academic papers would cite my case for decades. Future researchers would study my exploitation as a historical example. I signed the consent forms for public testimony, knowing my privacy would never fully return. Rachel's overconfidence became her downfall at the national conference. She presented my sewer slide attempt audio to demonstrate authentic trauma capture. The recording played for 300 attendees while she discussed remarkable data quality. Several disability advocates in the audience recognized the exploitation immediately. They recorded her presentation, creating evidence of her methods. My testimony to the ethics board focused on preventing future harm rather than personal revenge. I presented Rachel's training materials, showing how she'd systematized exploitation. I demonstrated the manipulation techniques she'd taught others. I kept the focus on protecting future students rather than dwelling on my own pain. The board needed to understand this wasn't isolated misconduct, but an emerging methodology. Academic momentum shifted as more victims came forward. Disabled students from multiple universities shared similar experiences with researchers using the TM method. Parents discovered their children's private moments in published research. Support group leaders realized their meetings had been infiltrated. The pattern of exploitation became undeniable as evidence accumulated. The night before the ethics hearing, I prepared my final evidence. Rachel's own recordings would condemn her, hours of her discussing subject cultivation with colleagues. I organized testimonies from other victims who'd agreed to speak. Catherine had provided training documents showing the deliberate nature of the exploitation. Everything pointed to systematic abuse disguised as innovation. The ethics committee hearing began in a small conference room. My advocate sat beside me while Rachel entered with Dr. Chen and 2 university lawyers. My parents sat in the back row, having chosen to support Rachel despite everything. The committee members reviewed thick folders of evidence. No media were allowed, keeping the focus on academic misconduct rather than public scandal. Both Rachel and I showed severe damage from our conflict. My weight loss and increased spasticity were visible. Rachel's polished academic persona had crumbled. She looked exhausted and defensive. We'd spent months destroying each other. The committee saw 2 people broken by their battle over research ethics. Neither of us resembled who we'd been when this started. The truth emerged through Rachel's own recordings. Audio played of her describing me as an ideal subject who performed trauma beautifully. She'd called my sewer slide attempt compelling data and praised my authentic vulnerability. The committee heard her instruct others to cultivate dependency in research subjects. Her clinical language stripped away any pretense of caring. Catherine's testimony proved crucial. She described her training in emotional manipulation, showing the committee Rachel's instruction manuals. She admitted to targeting 3 other disabled students using techniques Rachel had taught her. She'd realized the exploitation only after I'd confronted her. Her testimony revealed how Rachel's methods were already spreading through academic networks. The ethics board's decision came swiftly. They ordered an immediate review of all research involving vulnerable populations at universities using Rachel's methods. Her techniques were formally banned from academic use. Existing studies using her methodology faced scrutiny. The board recognized the systematic nature of the exploitation and moved to prevent its spread. Previously authenticated conference recordings became key evidence. Footage showed Rachel training dozens of researchers in manipulation techniques during professional development workshops. She'd created an entire academic movement around exploiting vulnerable subjects. The board saw how close her methods had come to becoming standard practice. Their ruling prevented a new form of institutional abuse. Evidence proved Rachel's methods deliberately created dependency while extracting trauma data. She designed protocols to keep subjects emotionally reliant on researchers. Her techniques ensured continuous access to private moments. The manipulation was intentional, systematic, and spreading. The board recognized this as a fundamental violation of research ethics, requiring immediate action. Rachel's breakdown during the hearing revealed complex motivations. She genuinely believed her research would help disabled people by capturing authentic experiences. She'd become addicted to the intimacy of others' pain while convincing herself she was advancing treatment. She sobbed while describing how the research had consumed her life. The committee saw someone who'd lost themselves in their work. The committee offered me a position developing new research protection protocols. They wanted my experience to shape policies protecting vulnerable populations. I would help create mandatory consent procedures and subject advocacy requirements. My exploitation could prevent future violations. The offer meant turning my trauma into systemic change. I chose advocacy over revenge. Instead of pursuing personal damages, I requested comprehensive reform, mandatory consent protocols, regular subject welfare checks, and independent advocacy for vulnerable research participants. I wanted Rachel to receive treatment rather than just punishment. The focus stayed on preventing future exploitation rather than retribution. Rachel faced academic sanctions and mandatory psychological treatment. Her research career ended, but she avoided criminal charges. She entered therapy to address her obsession with others' trauma. The committee required her to undergo ethics retraining before any future academic work. Her punishment focused on rehabilitation rather than destruction. 3 months later, the disability community remained divided. Some supported my advocacy, grateful for the new protections. Others worried that research restrictions would limit academic understanding of disabled experiences. Support groups debated whether Rachel's methods, despite being unethical, had produced valuable insights. The community struggled to balance protection with research needs. My new role as a research ethics advocate meant constant reminders of my trauma. Every policy meeting required revisiting my exploitation. Training sessions meant explaining how Rachel had manipulated me. I helped other victims navigate the reporting process. My private pain had become a public resource for preventing future harm. Federal research protections passed 6 months later. My case became the primary example in training materials. Universities implemented mandatory advocate programs for vulnerable research subjects. Consent procedures required independent verification. Rachel's methods became a cautionary tale taught in research ethics courses. The personal costs remained heavy. My family relationships never fully recovered. Nathan stayed distant, unable to reconcile my actions with Rachel's version of events. My parents maintained that Rachel had tried to help, even after seeing the evidence. Some friendships ended permanently. Privacy became impossible as my story spread through academic and advocacy circles. My health stabilized, but never returned to pre-conflict levels. The stress had caused permanent increases in spasticity. Chronic pain required ongoing management. Trust remained difficult. I questioned everyone's motives, wondering who might be studying me. Rachel had taught me to see see potential exploitation everywhere. The motel room became my permanent home. I couldn't afford accessible housing on an advocate's salary. The cramped space reminded me daily of what fighting Rachel had cost. But calls from protected students made it worthwhile. Parents thanked me for preventing their children's exploitation. Researchers contacted me for ethical guidance. Catherine completed her own ethics training and became an advocate. She worked to identify students targeted by researchers using Rachel's methods. Her insider knowledge helped expose ongoing exploitation. She testified at other universities, sharing how she'd been trained to manipulate vulnerable people. Her transformation from exploiter to protector showed change was possible. My story appeared in ethics textbooks within a year. Case studies analyzed the exploitation, consent violations, and systemic failures. Students debated whether Rachel's intentions mattered given her methods. Professors used my experience to teach research boundaries. My trauma educated future researchers about ethical limits. Rachel sent one letter through her therapist. She acknowledged the harm she'd caused while maintaining her research had value. She described her own therapy process, learning to separate academic curiosity from human connection. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but wanted me to know she finally understood the violation. I never responded. The disability advocacy group reformed with new protections. Researchers required explicit permission to attend. Meetings included independent advocates monitoring for exploitation. Members learned to recognize manipulation tactics. The group that had been Rachel's laboratory became a model for protected peer support. A year later, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about research ethics. My wheelchair didn't fit well at the witness table. Committee members listened as I described systematic exploitation disguised as innovation. My testimony supported federal funding for subject advocacy programs. Real change happened slowly through bureaucratic processes. My daily routine centered on preventing what happened to me. Morning calls with exploitation victims, afternoon policy meetings, evening support groups for research subjects, weekends reviewing consent procedures. My life revolved around protection work. The trauma that defined me became my purpose. The final ethics review confirmed Rachel's permanent ban from human subjects research. Her methodology papers were retracted from academic journals. Conference presentations featuring my recordings were removed from archives. Her academic legacy erased, replaced by warnings about exploitation. She worked in data entry now, far from vulnerable populations. 2 years after everything began, I attended a conference on research ethics. Speakers cited my case while discussing protection protocols. Young researchers approached me with questions about ethical boundaries. I'd become what Rachel had made me, a teaching example. But this time, I'd chosen the lesson being taught. My testimony helped establish the National Center for Research Subject Protection. The center provided advocates, reviewed consent procedures, and investigated exploitation reports. Funding came from universities previously using Rachel's methods. Institutions that had enabled exploitation now paid for prevention. I never walked again, but I learned to navigate more than campus. The protection systems I helped create prevented thousands of vulnerable people from experiencing what I had. Rachel's exploitation of my trauma ultimately protected others from similar harm. My stolen privacy became a public shield for future research subjects. The work continued daily, reviewing protocols, training advocates, supporting victims. Each protected student justified the cost. My pain had transformed into systemic change. Not the healing I'd imagined, but purpose born from exploitation. Rachel had made me a subject. I'd made myself a guardian.